I'm here to talk about the research that Zeldis did with the FINRA Investor Education Foundation and the CFA Institute. We partnered together to conduct the study about millennials and investing. You can see, and you'll see as we go through, that it's structured sort of based on some hypotheses or some sort of conventional wisdom myths that are out there about millennials, and some of the data that we found that either did or did not, in most cases, did not support that conventional wisdom. But there's a lot of interesting pieces here. I'm not showing you everything here today. There was a lot in the research, and welcome, you'll have access. I'm going to put up a link at the end where you can go ahead and see the full data set, the full report, and everything we did. But let me jump in and kind of talk about the research, the methodology, and what exactly it is that we did. So we did a large-scale online quantitative survey. You can actually see the note there at the bottom. We did some qualitative research as well. We did some webcam focus groups with investors, millennial, as well as Gen Xers and Boomers, and advisors as well. But the core of this research that we're going to be talking about today is the quantitative piece. We surveyed a total of just over 2,800 consumers with a focus on millennials. 1,800 or so of those were millennials. We decided we wanted, beforehand, we wanted to focus on 3 specific segments of millennials, and you'll see much of the data is divided that way. We wanted to look at millennials that had no investments whatsoever, so that's our first subset. Those who only have some sort of retirement account, whether that's an employer-sponsored retirement account like a 401k or an IRA of some kind, but nothing else. And then the last group are those that hold some type of taxable investment accounts. That last group might also have retirement accounts, but they also have some kind of taxable investment. In addition, we did a sampling of Gen Xers and Baby Boomers who are investors as kind of a comparison segment to our investing millennial segment. When we did our sampling, we balanced the initial completes on census proportions to get a representation of the general population. Then we targeted our quotas by the 3 groups I talked about and weighted the sample back to be nationally representative. I want to dive right in, but I want to kind of show you a little bit of a profile of those 3 segments we talked about, just so you can see what they look like and how they compare to one another. So I mentioned that those 3 segments, and you can see here we have the millennials who don't have any kind of investments, the ones that just have retirement accounts, and the ones with taxable investment accounts. And you can see just kind of at a glance that those with taxable accounts are much more likely to be male. They are, not surprisingly, if you look at that bottom piece, the income increases over the course, over these 3 segments. As you might expect, the more money you have, the more likely you are to have investments. You can see those with retirement accounts and taxable investments are more educated than our non-investing millennial segment. More likely, those with taxable accounts are more likely to have children. They're somewhat more likely to be Caucasian. But this just kind of gives you a sense of those 3 segments that we looked at demographically. I'm going to jump into the data here, and as you'll see throughout, there'll be some kind of myths and the reality, but there'll also be some other data points that we thought were interesting that I want to share with everybody. So first, we're going to look at financial goals, and this is where we come into our first myth, or conventional wisdom. And that is that millennials would have very lofty financial goals, that they think they're going to, retire as millionaires at age 40, that they're going to, own all their, own businesses, and that they're really ambitious and really optimistic in terms of their goals. The reality is that we found millennials' goals tend to be modest, and especially for some of our segments that we looked at. So you'll see the first segment, those non-investing millennials, when you look at their top financial goals, they're really modest, right? They're not living paycheck to paycheck. They're just being able to pay their bills, having some savings for unexpected expenses. Even when you move to that segment with retirement accounts, you're looking at some of the same things, having savings for unexpected expenses, here you start to see retirement, saving enough for retirement come into play, being able to travel, and you see that even more so with those with the taxable accounts, wanting to be able to retire when they want and live comfortably, having enough to travel, again, having enough for unexpected expenses. You can see that that taxable account segment lines up with the Gen Xers and the Boomer taxable account segment in terms of financial goals. So very similar, not more ambitious, not more lofty, really similar for the investable, for those with taxable investments, similar to older generations. You know, those without investments, much more modest. One of the core objectives of the research, and one of the things we looked at was, you know, what are some of the barriers to investing and what are some of the motivators that help, you know, get folks started, millennials started with investing. So again, here we have a myth, and this one wasn't really busted per se. It was just tweaked a little bit, and that was the conventional wisdom was that income and debt are the key barriers to investing. That the reason millennials don't invest is because they don't have enough income and they have too much debt. When you look at the data here, which are the top barriers to investing in taxable accounts, you see that income and debt are definitely at the top of that list. They are definitely major barriers to investing. But something that we saw come up in a couple different questions was that a lack of knowledge, not having enough knowledge about investing was also a critical barrier. So you see it here at 39%, not enough knowledge, not confident in their knowledge about investing. You see that as also a pretty significant barrier to investing. And you can see that it's fairly similar in terms of the reasons why both of our non-taxable investment groups are not investing, although you see the retirement account, millennials, it's a little more about debt, whereas for those who aren't investing at all, it's a little bit more about income, just not having the money. We also see when we asked an open-ended question, what might get you to invest? What might make you invest? You see that the biggest circle there, you know, of course, is more money. If I had more money, and that does speak to those kind of key, you know, those biggest barriers of income and debt. But the next most common open-ended response we saw was around that knowledge, not knowing where to start, not having the information they need, not knowing what to do or where to go. So that's something that I think is important as a barrier that maybe doesn't get as much attention. And that desire for more knowledge is much more likely in women than men. They're much more likely to say that if they had more knowledge, they'd be more likely to invest. Another kind of important barrier that isn't listed here, and it wasn't listed in the previous slide, but something that we saw interestingly, are that those who have no investment, no retirement account or taxable accounts are much less likely to have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. So they're not even exposed to investing. So if you look at this chart here, you see that non-investing millennials are much more likely to not be employed full-time. Those who are employed full-time are less likely to have access to a retirement plan through their employer. And those who even have access to a retirement plan are much less likely to have an employer match. So you can see here, and we saw this in other areas of the data, that it seems like having that 401k or other employer-sponsored retirement account can be a stepping stone that gets people to invest. And so you see those people that have no investments really are lacking that access to having that account through their employer, having that first exposure to investing. Interesting data, kind of related, but not directly. We wanted to find out how millennials felt about auto-enrollment for employer-sponsored retirement accounts. So this idea that you're opted in automatically and you actually have to opt out if you do not want to participate in your 401k or other employer-sponsored retirement plan. We saw that 52% of millennials said that their employers who offer a retirement plan have auto-enrollment. Pretty consistent across the country, a little bit higher in the Midwest. But one thing we wanted to see is how do people feel about that? When it first became popular, there was a fear that there would be this backlash against auto-enrollment. People really wouldn't like it. But that's not the case at all. It's not what we saw. millennials are largely very positive about the idea of sort of automatically being opted in and having to opt out. 75% overall are positive, only 4% are negative. You see those with taxable accounts are more likely to be positive. Those are who are familiar with investing, but it's across the board. All three of our subgroups are much more likely to be positive than negative towards that idea. Another myth that we looked at, millennials have this reputation for being overconfident and feeling like they know everything, being able to do everything themselves. So one of the myths was that since millennials are overconfident in general, they would probably be overconfident about investing as well. Definitely not what we saw. When it comes to decisions about investing, they are definitely not so self-assured. More than half of those who have taxable investment accounts lack confidence in making investment decisions. So only 47% of that group who have taxable investments actually feel very or extremely confident. Most do not. And when you look at the millennials with retirement accounts only, that number jumps substantially. 79% lack confidence. So this is definitely something, and it maybe ties into that knowledge piece, that this is an area where millennials do not necessarily feel confident about their knowledge and decision making. We also wanted to look at, we want to talk to those who were investing and find out what triggered them, what were some of the reasons they started investing. And the top two that we saw were just individual curiosity and interest. And this is something we heard in the qualitative we did as well. People were just kind of interested in the market and thought it was fun to kind of have investments and follow them. But the other really key trigger or influence are parents and family members. Someone kind of introducing them in their family to investing really was something that led a lot of them to start investing. You can see here that for the retirement-only accounts, the employer was key, right? Because that's how they're investing. They're investing through their employer, so it was more likely to be a trigger for them. Related to that family influence, we saw something kind of really surprising and interesting that we didn't expect. We asked folks when they started to invest, what age they were when they started to invest. And here you see of all of our generations who have taxable accounts, 31% of the millennials with taxable accounts started investing under the age of 21. You compare that with the Gen Xers, only 14% started under 21, and the Baby Boomers, only 9%. So definitely a shift towards a younger, being younger when you start to invest. And when you look at the influence of family members, if our millennial had a family member talk to them about investing when they were under 18, when they were a child, they're even more likely to have started investing early. You can see 50% of those whose parents spoke to them before they were 18 about investing started investing before they were 21. So really interesting, looking at kind of the influence of parents on getting folks to invest and getting them to do so earlier. I want to talk a little bit about millennials' attitudes towards financial professionals. Something else, another kind of myth or something that maybe conventional wisdom or that we expected to see was that millennials would be very skeptical towards the financial industry as a whole, but also towards financial professionals, that they wouldn't trust them, that they would be wary of them. And I will say we got a hint that this wasn't the case in our qualitative, because we really heard much more positive descriptions of financial professionals than negative when we did the focus groups we did. So again, one of our myths was that millennials would be wary of the financial services industry and by extension financial professionals. What we found was that millennials acknowledge and respect the expertise that financial professionals can provide. So overall, we've got 41% of our millennials using some type of financial professional. And those who do use a financial professional tend to be very satisfied. So 72% of those across our segments are highly satisfied with their current financial professional. So there's generally a positive feeling towards financial professionals. And we see that when we ask them questions as to why people do or do not use a financial professional. When we asked why they don't use a financial professional, the biggest reason was cost, by far. They feel it's going to be too expensive, followed by they don't feel like they have enough money to make it worthwhile. But when you look at trust, that's way down on the list. Only 15% mention not trusting them as an issue. So clearly it isn't that this negative perception of financial professionals being the barrier. Why folks do work with a financial professional, we see, it makes them feel more confident. Back to that idea that they aren't overconfident about their own knowledge and decision-making when it comes to investment. So they like to have that financial professional to help them with that. And they also think it will help their performance. Interestingly, when we look at what's important to them when it comes to a financial professional, what they value, how they can build that relationship with a financial professional. So the question here was, what can a financial professional do to build that trust, build that relationship? Little bit of a contrast to what we've seen with older generations when we've done research about working with financial professionals, where it used to be about friendship, about that relationship. You can look here at the bottom of this list is getting to know me as a person. That's the least important thing. The most important thing is taking the time to educate me, and then knowing they have my interest above theirs. So this is somewhere where maybe some of the stereotypes about millennials do come into play. This idea that they like to go on and learn how to do things for themselves, watch YouTube videos. You can see, like, in a financial professional, they're looking a little bit more for a teacher than they are a friend. And that may be somewhat in contrast with earlier generations. The other thing that is really interesting here is we expected millennials to want to do everything, via email or, using technology more, less wanting to do it face-to-face. But you can see at the bottom there, 58% of millennials agree that when it comes to working with a financial advisor, they would prefer to work face-to-face. So they really still do value that relationship and that interaction. That was a little bit of a surprise. We heard that in the qualitative we did as well, and interesting kind of nuance that came out in the qualitative is that it didn't have to be literally meeting in person. It could be video chat. There still could be a technological element, but they still want that relationship. They still want that back and forth. They don't want it to be all emails and texts. Another interesting finding that surprised us, this one really did. Some of the other ones, we didn't necessarily buy into the myth, but this one, we really thought millennials would overestimate the investable assets they had to have to work with a financial professional. So a lot of times you hear, well, I can't work with an advisor. I don't have enough money to make it worthwhile. So we thought people would think you need, $500,000, $1 million to make it worthwhile to work with a financial professional. Quite the opposite was the case. Millennials underestimated the investable assets needed. 20% of all the millennials we spoke to said there's no minimum amount that you need to work with a financial professional. 6 in 10 thought that a financial professional would work with them if they had $10,000 or less. This isn't necessarily wrong, because there are certain types of financial advice and robo-advisors, other things where you can get financial advice not having a lot of money. For the most part, financial advisors do have thresholds where they're comfortable working with investors, and typically they are looking for investments, more than $10,000. So that was a little bit of a surprise. Another interesting element is that millennials really had no idea how much it costs for professional financial advice. 42% said they just couldn't answer. They said, I don't know. We asked them to estimate what percent of their assets, they would have to pay to work with a financial advisor. We said, sometimes a financial advisor takes a percent of your investable assets, the fee. What percent do you think? 42% said don't know. They wouldn't even answer it. 77% thought it was 5% or more. And we had a lot of people said 10%. So there's really this perception that working with a financial advisor is very, very expensive. And I would recommend, at the link at the end of this survey, you can go on the FINRA Foundation's website. They did a video where they talked to some people on the street and interviewed them about some of these topics. Really interesting. And you hear the same kind of thing. You hear people saying, I don't know, 5%, 10%. So that was definitely a surprise. And just, I don't have the data right here in front of us, but for Gen Xers and Boomers, they were still off, but they were much more realistic about what it costs to work with a financial advisor. One of the things we looked at in the data were some emerging innovations in the investment industry, in the investment space, different products and services that are newer, like robo-advisors, socially responsible investments, sometimes called ESG, cryptocurrency. And we fully expected that these were things that were really going to get the attention of millennials and be something of interest. We didn't necessarily think that the current usage would be high, but we thought that millennials would be much more aware of these things, and we thought if we described these things, they'd be much more interested in them. So yet another myth. This was one, again, that we really expected and were surprised by. So the myth or the conventional wisdom would be that millennials gravitate towards robo-advisors and other kind of new trends in investing. But the reality is that was not the case at all. So familiarity with, use of, and interest in those innovations was definitely pretty limited among millennials. Not very different than among Gen Xers or Boomers. So you can look here at the top table in terms of having used any of these things. This was, single digit, low single digits in terms of, using a robo-advisor, socially conscious investing, cryptocurrencies, or investment crowdfunding, which are the 4 innovations we looked at. Familiarity also low, in the low teens, low to mid-teens, and significant proportions who have never even heard of these things. Cryptocurrency, most people hadn't heard of. That's kind of in the news. We hear about Bitcoin, but some of these other things, a third or more, 37% never heard of a robo-advisor, that idea. But so as I mentioned, we then described these things. There's a little bit of paragraph about what it is at a basic level. And then we asked kind of interest in potentially using these things. And again, still quite low. When you look at robo-advisors, only 16% said they would be very or extremely interested in using a robo-advisor. The highest was socially responsible investing, but even that was only 23% of millennials. So again, not a lot of interest in these different innovations, and that was a bit of a surprise for us. The last kind of myth or conventional wisdom, and again, this was one that we didn't buy into as a group of researchers, was, there is this tendency for the media and other groups to treat millennials as this homogeneous group. Everybody is the same. They all do the same thing. They all have the same behaviors. So one of the myths was that all millennials are the same and that they would have similar investing attitudes and behaviors. I don't think this was a huge surprise to us that was not the case, but it was interesting to see some of the subgroup differences. I'm not going to show all of them here. I have a couple of slides on a few of them, but the full data has even more. We focused a lot on disparities in geography, gender, and racial lines. So I'm going to go into a couple of these in more detail, but just at a high level, we found that rural millennials were kind of being left behind. They were much less likely to be investing, and you'll see I have a little more detail on that in a second. Women also, I mentioned before, women were more open to having knowledge. They were more likely to say that having more knowledge would make them be more likely to invest. They're also less confident. And then African American and Hispanics are about 29% less likely to have taxable investments as well. So just a deep dive on a couple of those, looking at the rural versus urban. Fewer invest now. You can see only 18% have taxable investments versus 27% of urban. Less likely to plan to invest in the next 5 years, less likely to be employed full-time, less likely to be confident, less confident in reaching their goals, worried about that, and just more kind of negative overall. They're more likely to, they're less likely to agree that they'll be better off than their parents were financially. They're less likely, half as likely to feel that their children will be better off than they are financially. and not at all optimistic about financial markets. So again, that rural element and the rural group of millennials definitely being left behind when it comes to investing and knowledge and confidence and optimism. Looking at men and women, women are less likely as well to have taxable investments. We saw that in the very first slide. They're less likely to be confident in making financial decisions. They're less likely to be confident that they're going to meet their goals. Also less optimistic about the economy, about financial markets. Talked about that knowledge, those last two rows there. They're more likely to cite knowledge as a barrier to investing, and they're more likely to say knowledge would make them likely to invest. So another kind of discrepancy among millennials, it's important to not lose kind of the nuance between the different groups to understand why folks aren't investing and what might encourage them to invest. So I'm going to leave it there. There's a lot more data. There's a lot more here. And I'm posting this slide here. There's a link to FINRAFoundation.org, has all of the data itself, the questionnaire, the full report, the video I mentioned, some infographics, completely open. They've completely, the FINRA Foundation and CFA Institute have put this out there for everybody to be able to dive into. Happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to have follow-up conversations with folks about the data. It was a very interesting study. We learned a lot of interesting things, and as I mentioned, there's just a lot more that I didn't dive into in this half hour, but would be happy to discuss further.